Our gospel reading this week continues in the Gospel of Luke as Jesus draws ever nearer to Jerusalem and the cross. Listen now for what the Spirit would say to us. On the way to Jerusalem, Jesus was going through the region between Samaria and Galilee. As he entered a village, 10 lepers approached him. Keeping their distance, they called out, saying, "Jesus, Master, have mercy on us." When he saw them, he said to them, "Go and show yourselves to the priest." And as they went, they were made clean. Then one of them, when he saw that he was healed, turned back, praising God with a loud voice. He prostrated himself at Jesus' feet and thanked him. And he was a Samaritan. Then Jesus asked, "Were not 10 made clean? But the other 9, where are they? Was none of them found to return and give praise to God except this foreigner?" Then he said to him, "Get up and go on your way. Your faith has made you well." And our translators chose what I think is an odd translation there, for the word translated "made you well" is more often translated "saved." Get up and go on your way. Your faith has saved you. The word of the Lord. Thanks be to God. When I do pre-marriage counseling, I try to prepare couples for the nearly inevitable progression that happens in most all long-term serious relationships. There's a beginning that is filled with wonder, with joyous discovery that leads to a deepening passion. It's the sort of passion that produces lines such as, "I only have eyes for you," which is true to some degree. Nothing matters as much, nothing else is as important, and so everything else is just a little out of focus. Nothing else quite gets full attention. And when people are in the throes of in love, sometimes logic and reasonableness takes a holiday. People will spend hours on the telephone, though they just saw one another and though they have important things to do. They will engage in extravagances, from doing things that they formerly considered ridiculous and silly to lavishing their beloved with expensive gifts that require them to cut back expensive in other areas. But almost without fail, the throes of in love began to wane. Over time, as couples settle in for the long haul, as they make a home together, as they get married and have children, the passion recedes. It's natural. Maintaining that initial intensity is difficult. And over time, other things, sometimes other passions, compete for attention. Children, careers, hobbies, causes, and so on, all vie for their share. And very often couples reach a point where they come to realize that, well, they more or less take one another for granted, that their relationship is largely about routines. Things may not be all that bad, there may not be any big problems, and the relationship may be comfortable enough. They still care for one another, are concerned for one another, but all the passion is gone. And some relationships begin to falter at this point. The small things can blow up into big conflicts. And some couples wonder, can this relationship be saved? And I think that relationship with God can go through a very similar progression. It can move from a point where there's passion to a relationship that is comfortable, to something where the relationship is taken for granted, where blessings from God are merely what God is supposed to do, and trouble in life feels like God failing us or letting us down. And I wonder if 9 of the lepers in our reading for this morning hadn't fallen into this sort of relationship with God. I'm assuming that they had been raised in the faith, that they had tried to live a good life. They went to synagogue, they made the standard offerings at the temple, they kept the law, they tried to attend the big religious festivals. And yet, after all this, they found themselves suffering with leprosy. Now, we need to realize that leprosy in the Bible is not the horrible disease of leper colonies. It is not what Hollywood sometimes portrays in biblical era movies such as Ben-Hur. And in the Bible, leprosy is a catch-all term that refers to most any skin disease, some serious, some less so. Things we would call fungal infections or eczema or psoriasis would all get labeled leprosy. And leprosy made you unclean. Regardless of how severe it was or not, it made you unclean. And when you were unclean, to touch someone else was to make them unclean. And so having leprosy could cause quite a few difficulties in your life. Besides whatever pain the ailment might bring you, you were not going to be invited to anybody's house for Passover dinner, or for any other dinner for that matter. You wouldn't be welcome at the synagogue or at the temple. And so it's hardly surprising that when 10 lepers hear that Jesus, with his reputation for healing, is in town, that they rush to see him. They keep their distance from Jesus as the law mandated for those who were unclean, and they plead for Jesus to help them. Jesus tells them, "Go and show yourselves to the priest." Now, priests had to certify that those who had been unclean were now clean. And so Jesus' command implies the promise of a healing. And so all 10 head out immediately. All 10 clearly believe, trust that Jesus can and will heal them. And indeed, all 10 are healed as they go on their way. But one of them comes running back, praising God, and throws himself at Jesus' feet in a grand display of gratitude and thanksgiving. And he was a Samaritan. Now, Samaritans believed in God and more or less in the law of Moses, but they were considered heretics by the Jews, not to mention a despised ethnic group. They were outsiders in every sense of the word, and I suspect that that explains why this Samaritan is praising God and running back to give thanks to Jesus. This Jewish rabbi, Jesus, had healed him, a Samaritan. The other 9, presumably all Jews, seemed to take this blessing of God more for granted and simply return to their daily lives. Now, I suppose that the Samaritan returns to his old life as well, but before he does, he receives something the others don't. All are healed, but Jesus tells the Samaritan that his faith has saved him. Now, our translation says, made him well, which is a possible way to translate this word. But I'm pretty sure that's a bad translation. Luke has already used 2 different words to say they were healed and that they were made clean. But Jesus singles out the Samaritan and tells him that his faith has saved him. This may not be the go to heaven kind of save that we sometimes think of when we hear this word. But it is a restoration, a renewal, something much bigger than simply being made well. This Samaritan has a passionate experience of God while the other 9 do not. As an outsider, he seems to have an advantage. He finds it easier to get excited about what God has done for him. And I fear that we in the church are sometimes a lot more like the other 9 than we are the Samaritan. Our faith often has lots of routine and not much passion. So, how do we become more like the Samaritan and less like the 9? I think the answer depends a bit on who you are. If you are already a bit like the Samaritan to begin with, and by that I mean you're not someone who's a lifelong church person, that in some way you're new to this, you may indeed have an advantage. Like a young person falling in love for the first time, it may actually be easier for you. There's still things you need to do. You need to spend time with God, with Jesus. That means reading the Bible and prayer. That means doing things with God, which is another way of saying finding spiritual practices and activities that suit you, finding things that you and God enjoy doing together. But what about the rest of us? Those of us who've been around God for an awfully long time and have gotten ourselves in some pretty deep ruts. Well, what would you tell couples who had lost their passion in a marriage? I would suggest that first they need to create some space for passion. They need to push aside some of those relationships and activities that are part of their lives, to get rid of some of the busy, stretched too thin lives that so many of us lead, and make some room for passion. And then you have to fall in love all over again. Like young lovers, you spend time together and find new things that you enjoy doing together. You begin lavishing the other with attention and gifts and little extravagances. You want to do things for the other that you know the other enjoys. And you happily cut back on things for yourself in order to do so. Of course, falling in love is a two-way street. The other must move towards you as well. And in Jesus, God does just that with remarkable passion, even to the point of risking death. Far too often the church has talked about this in the language of contracts and formulas. But dying for another, that's the language of love. I would die for you is a line for a love song. A Samaritan, surprised to discover how much Jesus loved him, found himself in the throes of passion that left him yelling, singing, and dropping at Jesus' feet in gratitude and thanksgiving. And Jesus said that this passion is a sign of something more than healing, of a restoration, of a renewal, of being fully and genuinely alive. Jesus, let me know this passion. Let me be fully and genuinely alive. All praise and glory to the God whose passionate love for us comes to us in Jesus. Thanks be to God.